The plate shattered on the diner floor as the girl fell hard, her cane knocked aside. Laughter followed. Not an accident, not a mistake, a choice. No one stood up, no one spoke. Plates clinked. Eyes turned away. Silence became a shield for cruelty. Then a retired Navy SEAL rose from his seat. Beside him, a German shepherd tensed. Some lines, once crossed, cannot be ignored. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Denver lay under a gray winter sky, snow packed hard along sidewalks and rooftops, the cold pressing everything into silence as if the city itself were holding its breath. Michael Carter had learned long ago that silence could be louder than gunfire. In war, silence meant danger, an ambush waiting, a wrong step away from death. In retirement, silence meant something else entirely. It meant mornings with nowhere urgent to be, coffee cooling too fast in a chipped mug, and the uncomfortable truth that the world kept moving whether he felt ready or not. At 45, Michael was a retired Navy SEAL in name only. The paperwork said he was done. His body mostly agreed. His mind did not. The habits remained. Waking before dawn, scanning exits without thinking, measuring rooms by angles and distance. Retirement hadn't erased the man he had been. It had simply taken away the mission that gave that man a purpose. Rex sat near the door, watching him. Michael didn't need to look to know that. He felt it, the steady presence, the quiet awareness that mirrored his own. Rex didn't fidget or beg for attention. Rex waited. That, more than anything, was what unsettled Michael on certain mornings. The dog still believed there was something worth waiting for. "Just breakfast," Michael muttered, more to himself than to Rex. "That's all." Rex rose immediately, tail still, posture alert. No questions, no hesitation. Outside, the cold bit through Michael's jacket as soon as he stepped onto the sidewalk. Denver winters were honest that way. They didn't pretend to be gentle. The snow had been plowed into uneven ridges along the street, and each breath came out white, visible proof that he was still here, still alive. He walked the few blocks to the diner at a measured pace, Rex keeping perfect alignment at his side. People noticed the dog. They always did. Some crossed the street. Others smiled nervously. Michael noticed everything but reacted to nothing. He had learned the cost of engaging too easily. The diner was small, tucked between a closed hardware store and a laundromat that smelled faintly of soap, even through its locked doors. Inside, the heat fogged the windows, blurring the city into indistinct shapes. Michael liked that. Blurred edges felt safer. He chose a corner booth without thinking, back to the wall, clear sight line to the door. Rex settled at his feet, calm but awake. Michael ordered coffee. The waitress gave Rex a cautious glance but said nothing. That, too, was familiar. As he waited, Michael let his thoughts drift where they always did when he wasn't careful. He thought about the last mission. Not the details. Those stayed locked away, but the moment afterward. The sound of rotors fading, the strange emptiness when the objective was complete and no new one replaced it. He had spent his adult life being useful in the most brutal ways imaginable. Now usefulness was measured in smaller, quieter acts, not snapping at strangers, not drinking before noon, not letting the past decide the future. Across the room, the door opened again, letting in a gust of snow and cold air. Emily Parker stepped inside. Michael noticed her immediately, not because she was loud or dramatic, but because she was trying very hard not to be. She paused just inside the doorway, brushing snow from her coat, adjusting her grip on the cane in her hand. The movement was careful, practiced, someone who had learned to plan every step. She looked around the diner the way someone looks at a test they desperately want to pass. Michael felt something tighten in his chest. Emily walked with determination that bordered on stubbornness, as if willpower alone might convince her leg to behave. Her eyes flicked toward the counter, then toward the empty tables, then back to the counter again. Michael didn't need to hear her thoughts to recognize them. He had worn that expression himself on days when failure felt less survivable than exhaustion. Rex lifted his head slightly. Michael rested his hand on the edge of the table, grounding himself. He told himself this wasn't his business. He told himself he was here for breakfast, nothing more. He told himself that the world was full of people struggling, and he couldn't fix all of it. But he watched anyway. Emily approached the counter and spoke quietly to the man behind it. The owner, maybe. There was something formal about the way she stood, shoulders squared, chin lifted just enough to signal self-respect. Michael recognized preparation when he saw it. She hadn't come here on a whim. She had come ready to prove something. The conversation lasted only a minute. The owner nodded, glanced briefly at her cane, then nodded again, this time slower, more cautiously. He gestured toward the back, toward what Michael guessed was the kitchen or office. Emily followed, relief flickering across her face like a candle catching flame. Michael exhaled without realizing he had been holding his breath. "Good," he murmured. Rex remained still, but his attention stayed fixed on the hallway where Emily had disappeared. Michael's coffee arrived. He wrapped his hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into his fingers. He told himself that was the end of it, that whatever happened next belonged to people who still had a place in this civilian world. But his mind betrayed him again. He imagined Emily preparing that morning, choosing clothes that looked professional but practical, rehearsing answers to questions she had already been asked too many times, bracing herself for disappointment. He imagined the weight of every previous rejection pressing down on this single chance. Michael knew what it was like to stand at the edge of something and tell yourself it had to work, because there wasn't room left for another failure. Rex shifted slightly, leaning closer to Michael's leg. "You feel it too?" Michael asked quietly. Rex didn't look up. He didn't need to. His presence was answer enough. Michael took a slow sip of coffee. Outside, the snow continued to fall, indifferent and steady. Inside, the diner hummed with low conversation, forks against plates, the ordinary sounds of ordinary lives. For the first time that morning, Michael felt the familiar warning stir deep in his chest, the instinct that told him this quiet was temporary. That something, somewhere in this small room, was about to tip the balance. He didn't know what role he would play in it yet. He only knew one thing for certain. Rex stayed alert. And so did he. Snow fell harder by mid-morning, whitening the streets of Denver and stretching the distance between the diner and the employee parking lot into something that felt far longer than it truly was. Michael Carter noticed the walk before he understood why it bothered him. From his booth, the world beyond the fogged window appeared muted, reduced to drifting white and blurred silhouettes. He was halfway through his coffee when he saw Emily Parker again, this time outside, moving slowly from the far end of the street toward the diner. The realization settled with a dull weight in his chest. The parking area for staff was nowhere near the building. It wasn't malicious, just inconvenient in the way systems often were, designed without imagining people who had to measure every step. Michael felt a familiar irritation rise, the kind that came not from anger, but from recognition. He knew this walk. Not the snow, not the cane, but the idea of being required to prove worth through endurance. Emily leaned into the cold, shoulders set, jaw tight, her focus narrowed to the path immediately ahead of her. Each step looked deliberate, rehearsed, as if she had already mapped the cost and decided to pay it anyway. Michael told himself again that this was not his concern. He had spent years intervening where others could not. Retirement, he reminded himself, meant learning when not to act. Rex remained still beneath the table, but Michael felt the subtle shift in the dog's attention, the quiet alertness that mirrored his own unease. Outside, Emily paused briefly, adjusting her grip on the cane, breathing through the cold that cut sharp into her lungs. Michael imagined the effort it took not to look around, not to invite pity or judgment, to move forward without spectacle. He knew that discipline. He had lived inside it. As Emily drew closer, Michael's mind betrayed him with memory, not of snow, but of long approaches under weight, boots sinking into terrain that did not care who you were or what you had already survived. He remembered thinking then that the hardest part was not the physical strain, but the knowledge that no one would see the effort unless you failed. Emily slipped slightly on a patch of compacted snow and recovered, quickly, refusing the stumble, the dignity of acknowledgement. Michael's fingers tightened around the mug. He felt Rex's presence press subtly against his leg, grounding him, reminding him that observation was not the same as interference. When Emily finally reached the door, she stopped for half a second longer than necessary, gathering herself, brushing snow from her sleeve, lifting her chin. To anyone else, it might have looked insignificant. To Michael, it looked like resolve being reforged in real time. Inside, the warmth of the diner rushed out to meet her as she opened the door, and Michael watched her cross the threshold with the faint, irrational hope that the worst part of her day was already behind her. He knew better than to trust that feeling. He had trusted it once before, in another life, and learned that endurance often only marked the beginning. Rex shifted again, not restless, not anxious, simply ready. Michael didn't move. He stayed where he was, telling himself that watching was enough, that sometimes the only thing you could do was bear witness. Yet, as Emily made her way back toward the counter, Michael felt the quiet certainty settle deeper in his gut, the same instinct that had warned him of danger long before it arrived. The walk through the snow had not been an obstacle placed by a single person, but it had revealed something all the same. How much effort was demanded before the day had truly begun. Michael took another sip of coffee, now lukewarm, and wondered how many tests a person was expected to pass before being allowed to simply stand still. Rex's calm presence reminded him that waiting did not mean surrender. Outside, the snow kept falling, indifferent, patient, and inside the diner, unseen lines were already being drawn. Inside the diner, winter was kept at bay by heat and routine, but tension crept in quietly, settling between clinking dishes and the unspoken pressure of a first working day. Michael Carter knew the rhythm of places like this, the measured pace of service, the invisible hierarchy of customers who believed money bought gravity, the way staff learned to move around egos as carefully as furniture. He had returned to his booth after watching Emily Parker step behind the counter, telling himself that whatever happened next belonged to her world, not his. Still, his attention refused to let go. Emily moved with careful concentration, every task approached as if it mattered more than it probably did, because to her, it did. She wiped a table twice instead of once, adjusted plates before they were asked for, listened more than she spoke. Michael recognized the posture of someone on probation with life itself, trying to prove usefulness without becoming a burden. Rex remained settled at his feet, outwardly relaxed, inwardly tracking shifts in tone and movement that others dismissed as background noise. The morning crowd thinned, replaced by a handful of late arrivals, among them a man whose presence seemed to bend the room slightly out of shape. He dressed well enough to signal wealth without effort, and he carried himself as if inconvenience were a personal insult. Michael did not know his name and did not need to. He had met the type in different uniforms, different countries. Emily approached the table with a tray, her focus narrowed to balance and distance, when the man extended his leg just enough to intercept the path of her cane. The contact was subtle, almost deniable, but Michael saw the calculation in it, the same kind that pretended accidents were acts of fate. Emily stumbled, tried to correct, and failed. The tray tipped, Dishes shattered against the floor, sound cutting through the diner like a sharp intake of breath. For a moment, everything froze. Emily stood there, stunned, pain and embarrassment colliding too fast to separate. The man leaned back, unimpressed, his voice loud enough to claim space as he dismissed the mess as clumsiness. He did not apologize. He did not even look at her as a person who might be hurt. Michael felt his jaw tighten. He did nothing. Not yet. The owner rushed over, concern flickering across his face before settling into something more cautious. He spoke to Emily quietly, guiding her away from the broken pieces, his words low and professional. Michael could not hear them, but he understood the tone. This was not about her well-being. This was about damage control. The man continued to complain, making a show of inconvenience, as if the disruption were an offense committed against him. Emily nodded as the owner spoke, shoulders drawn in, absorbing blame she had not earned. Michael watched her hands tremble briefly before she stilled them the way soldiers learn to quiet shaking under scrutiny. Rex's attention sharpened, not aggressive, not alarmed, simply aware that something essential had shifted. The owner led Emily toward the back, away from the dining area, and the door closed behind them. Michael remained seated, the impulse to stand held in check by years of conditioning that warned against premature action. He told himself that this was a misunderstanding, that the owner would do the right thing, that the man would be asked to leave, or at least to lower his voice. He told himself that civilian rules were different, that intervention carried costs he no longer had institutional protection to absorb. But the man did not quiet down. He grew bolder, sensing the room's reluctance, mistaking silence for agreement. When Emily returned, her eyes were steady but distant. Something dimmed behind them. Michael understood that the conversation in the back had not gone the way it should have. The owner avoided her gaze, gestured vaguely, and returned to the counter. Emily resumed her work, slower now, guarded. The man smirked. Michael felt the familiar calculation rise unbidden, the assessment of distance, timing, consequence. Rex shifted his weight, not moving forward, not retreating, simply aligning himself closer to Michael's leg. The diner resumed its surface normalcy, but underneath, the balance had changed. Michael knew that look on Emily's face, the one that came after realizing that effort did not guarantee fairness. He had worn it himself years ago after discovering that rules applied unevenly depending on who you were. He stayed seated, telling himself that this was not the moment, that restraint was also a kind of discipline. Yet as the man continued to occupy the space with his contempt, Michael felt the certainty settle that restraint alone would not be enough today. Something had been broken that could not be swept away with the shards on the floor, and he sensed that the next test would not be hers alone. By early afternoon, the diner felt smaller, the winter light outside dimming as clouds thickened, pressing cold against the windows while something heavier settled inside the room. Michael Carter sensed the shift before it fully took shape. It was not a sound or a movement, but a change in intention, the kind he had learned to recognize long before words were spoken. The man at the table had grown louder, more careless, testing how far his presence could stretch without consequence. Emily Parker moved carefully near the counter, avoiding his space, but avoidance had never satisfied people like him. Michael stayed seated, every instinct pulling against restraint. He told himself again that he was retired, that stepping in now would drag consequences he no longer had a unit or command to absorb. Rex remained close, his awareness sharp, not aggressive, but ready in the quiet way that came from long training and absolute trust. When the man spoke again, his voice cutting through the diner with deliberate provocation, Michael saw Emily flinch despite her effort to remain composed. The man accused her of incompetence, of wasting his time, of being a liability, each word chosen to strip rather than argue. Michael felt the familiar burn rise behind his ribs, the one he associated with moments when inaction became a decision of its own. He stood, The movement was simple, unannounced, but it drew attention like a dropped plate. Michael stepped between the man and Emily, not touching, not threatening, simply occupying the space that had been used against her. Rex rose with him, positioning himself without command, his focus locked on Michael's intent rather than the man's insults. Michael spoke calmly, asking the man to lower his voice, to step back, to let the staff handle their work. There was no aggression in his tone, only finality. The man laughed, a short sound edged with disbelief, then shifted his posture, recasting himself instantly as the offended party. He accused Michael of intimidation, of bringing a dangerous animal into a public space, of causing a disturbance where none had existed before. The speed of the reversal was impressive, almost professional. Michael did not raise his voice. He did not move closer. He did not argue facts. He had learned that truth rarely won in rooms that feared conflict more than injustice. Around them, the diner fell into a familiar paralysis. Patrons looked down at their plates, at their phones, at anything that absolved them from choosing a side. The owner hovered near the counter, torn between responsibility and self-preservation, offering weak gestures toward calm without naming the source of the problem. Emily stood frozen, caught between gratitude and fear, aware that Michael's presence had drawn a line she would be forced to live with after he left. Rex remained steady, a quiet barrier that made the man's bravado falter for just a fraction of a second. The man seized on that hesitation, raising his voice further, declaring that he felt threatened, that he would call the police, that he would not be disrespected by some washed-up stranger. The words landed with precision, crafted to attract authority rather than resolution. Michael felt the room closing ranks against him not out of malice, but convenience. Silence, he knew, often chose the side that promised least disruption. When the police were mentioned, the owner finally intervened more forcefully, not to defend Emily or Michael, but to demand that the situation end before it damaged business. Michael stepped back half a pace, signaling de-escalation, but the damage was already done. The man pointed at him, accusing him openly of assault, of threats that had never been made. No one contradicted him. No one said they had seen what happened. Michael understood then that this was not a misunderstanding to be resolved, but a narrative being written in real time. Rex felt the change pressing closer, his loyalty unshaken even as the environment turned hostile. Emily's eyes met Michael's briefly, filled with apology she should not have needed to offer. Michael gave her a small nod, an unspoken assurance that this was not her fault, that some costs were chosen freely. As sirens echoed faintly in the distance, growing nearer, Michael remained still, centered, already adjusting to the reality that protection often came with a price paid later, alone. The man straightened, satisfied, having successfully shifted the role of aggressor. Michael watched the door, felt Rex steady at his side, and knew that whatever happened next would not be decided by fairness, but by who was willing to speak when silence was safest. Snow kept falling into the evening, softening the streets of Denver, while tension hardened elsewhere, invisible but deliberate, moving through offices and conversations that never raised their voices. Michael Carter sat in the holding room with his hands resting loosely on his knees, posture calm, breath measured. Years ago, this kind of waiting would have come before a mission brief or an extraction. Now it came with fluorescent lights and a bench bolted to the floor. He felt the familiar urge to catalog the space, to assess exits and angles, then dismissed it. There was no maneuvering here, only endurance. Rex was not with him, and the absence pressed heavier than the metal door. Michael focused on what he could control: stillness, silence, restraint. Across town, Emily Parker walked home through the snow with steps slower than usual, the events replaying in her mind with cruel precision. The way the room had turned quiet. The way the accusation had stuck because no one had challenged it. She felt the pressure before it announced itself. the subtle shift from discomfort to threat. The phone call came less than an hour later, polite in tone, firm in intent. A warning dressed as advice. She was told it would be better not to complicate things, better not to involve herself further, better to let people handle matters they understood. Emily listened, thanked the caller, and ended the conversation with hands shaking. She had heard this language before, after her accident, after previous rejections, always implying that resistance was irresponsible. The diner owner called next, voice strained, explaining that business had suffered enough disruption for one day. He suggested time off, suggested distance, suggested forgetting. Emily stood in her darkened apartment, snow tapping against the window, and felt the weight of being asked to disappear quietly. At the station, Michael was informed of the complaint against him, the language carefully chosen to frame intervention as aggression. He recognized the pattern immediately. This was not about facts, but about momentum. Someone had influence, and it was being applied methodically. Michael did not argue. He knew better than to feed a narrative designed to consume reaction. He thought of Rex, of the discipline the dog carried without question, and let that steadiness anchor him. Emily sat on her couch, coat still on, replaying Michael's nod, the wordless assurance he had offered when everything began to tilt. She wondered what it had cost him, stepping forward when everyone else stepped back. The thought settled uncomfortably in her chest, followed by something sharper: responsibility. Pressure worked best when it isolated its targets, when each person believed they were alone. Emily picked up her phone again, this time not to retreat, but to call someone whose number had been offered quietly earlier, a name spoken with hesitation but respect. At the same time, Michael was released pending review, warned without being threatened, free without being cleared. Outside, the cold hit him immediately. Rex was returned moments later, pressing close, not frantic, simply reaffirming presence. Michael rested a hand briefly against the dog's shoulder, grounding himself. He understood now that the conflict had shifted shape. It was no longer contained to the diner. It had moved into systems and silence, into the places where accountability went to soften and disappear. As Michael and Rex walked into the falling snow, and as Emily waited for her call to be answered, both felt the same truth settle in different ways. This was not over, and whatever came next would demand more than patience. The courthouse in Denver stood heavy beneath a clearing winter sky, snow melting into gray slush along the steps as the city waited, unaware that a small truth was about to settle where silence once ruled. Michael Carter entered the building with the same measured calm he had carried into rooms far more dangerous, aware that this place demanded a different kind of discipline, one that required restraint rather than force, patience rather than speed, and trust in systems he had learned not to rely on blindly. Rex walked beside him not as a weapon or a warning, but as a presence that steadied Michael's breathing, a reminder that loyalty did not need witnesses to exist. Emily Parker arrived shortly after, moving carefully but without hesitation, her cane tapping softly against stone floors that echoed more loudly than she expected. She had barely slept. Every conversation from the past days replayed in her mind, the polite threats, the warnings disguised as concern, the suggestion that her life would be easier if she chose silence. Standing there now, she understood that silence had never made her life easier, only smaller. The hearing itself was not dramatic in the way stories promised. There were no raised voices, no sudden confessions, only statements, timelines, and a careful reconstruction of events that had once seemed so overwhelming in their immediacy. A city traffic officer testified briefly, presenting footage from a nearby street camera that had been overlooked at first. A simple angle showing the diner entrance, the moment of the fall, the man's deliberate movement, and Michael stepping forward only after Emily was already on the ground. The video did not tell a story of heroes or villains. It told a story of sequence, and sequence mattered. Michael listened without reaction, eyes forward, letting the facts speak where he once would have filled the space with action. Emily took the stand next. Her voice shook only once, then steadied. She described her first day of work, the long walk through the snow from the employee parking area, the careful preparation she had believed might protect her from failure. She did not exaggerate the fall or the pain. She spoke instead about the humiliation, about being made invisible and conspicuous at the same time, about the moment she realized that no one was going to intervene unless someone chose to. When she finished, she did not look at the man who had accused Michael. She looked at the floor, grounding herself, understanding that speaking the truth did not guarantee comfort, only clarity. The diner owner was called next, his testimony hesitant, burdened by self-preservation. He admitted that he had asked Emily to step away, not because she was at fault, but because he feared escalation. The admission landed quietly, yet it shifted something fundamental. Fear, once named, lost some of its authority. The accusations against Michael unraveled without ceremony. The claim of assault dissolved under the absence of evidence. The suggestion of threat collapsed when examined alongside the footage and witness statements. Michael felt the tension leave his body gradually, not as relief, but as release. Rex sensed the change before Michael consciously acknowledged it, pressing closer for a brief moment, then settling again, duty fulfilled without expectation of reward. When the ruling came, it was brief and procedural, clearing Michael of wrongdoing and closing the matter with the kind of finality that rarely felt satisfying, but was enough. Outside, the winter sun had broken through the clouds, light reflecting sharply off the wet pavement. Emily stood on the courthouse steps, breathing in air that felt different than it had that morning, not warmer, but lighter. Michael joined her, hands in his pockets, unsure what words were appropriate, now that the purpose which had bound their paths was complete. Rex stood between them, content, as if understanding that the conflict had passed without needing to understand its details. Emily spoke first, thanking Michael not for intervening, but for staying when it would have been easier to walk away. Michael shook his head slightly, the gesture small but sincere, explaining that some lines did not disappear just because a uniform was put away. They stood together for a moment longer, watching people move past them, unaware of how close silence had come to winning. Emily turned back toward the street, toward a future that remained uncertain, but no longer defined by fear alone. Michael watched her go, not with regret, but with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that this time restraint and action had found balance. He and Rex walked in the opposite direction, leaving no mark on the city beyond the absence of harm. As the snow continued to melt and the day resumed its ordinary rhythm, Michael felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, not purpose as he had once known it, but acceptance, the understanding that honor did not end with service, and that sometimes the most complete victories were the ones that allowed everyone to simply move forward. Sometimes the miracle we wait for does not arrive as thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes it arrives quietly through an ordinary person who chooses to do the right thing when silence would be easier. God does not always change our circumstances in an instant, but He places strength, conscience, and courage in human hearts so that justice can still find its way into the world. In everyday life, we are given small moments that test who we truly are. A moment to look away, or a moment to stand firm, a moment to stay silent, or a moment to protect someone who cannot protect themselves. Those choices, though unseen by most, are where faith becomes action and where God's presence is often revealed. If this story touched your heart, let it remind you that you matter, your choices matter, and kindness is never wasted. Please share this story with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment with your thoughts or a